Thanks for being here. I know it's cold and morning, and everyone seems to be fairly awake. So I'm going to do a little bit of entertaining with some storytelling. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the history of gem cutting. My name is K Prim. I'm an American gem cutter and lapidary historian, and I'm working at a school in Bangkok teaching gem cutting. So we've been doing this for a couple of years, and really working with a lot of new cutters and working with different cutters around the world. And for the last few years, I've been working on a book about the history of gem cutting and kind of traveling around Europe and traveling around the wider world, meeting gem cutters and documenting their stories and their techniques. And so a lot of that material is what gave me the material for this talk. So aside from just talking to the cutters about their story, I've actually been able to sit down with them sometimes and learn their techniques and cut some stones and the techniques that they do. So I've really been able to compare in a really direct way the different cutting styles of all the different cultures around the world, or as I go along, I get to do more and more and more. So I've been really lucky to be able to meet cutters in Thailand and Sri Lanka and the UK and France and Switzerland, and then also training in gemology at GIA and AIGS. So trying to really understand this story in a really complete way. And so what I want to talk to you guys about today is going to come through three threads. So the story of gem cutting is going to be talking about the actual cutters, the people that did the cutting, how did they live, where were they at, the technology that they were using to be able to do this work. And of course, I want to talk to you guys about the story of the stones themselves. So how did they change over time? How did we understand gemstones and through the science of gemology? And of course, the styles and the patterns that we were cutting them with. So this story is going to jump kind of all over Europe. I've really narrowed down this talk to just mostly talking about Europe, because this is where the modern story of cutting begins. So I'm going to be bouncing all around Europe and talking to you guys about some of the important localities and some of the technology that's popped up. And then finally at the end, we'll see how it jumps over the pond and comes over to America. So if we want to understand the story of gem cutting, we really need to go back and understand how were gems being traded in the earliest days of European history. So we really need to understand the first place was Venice. Venice was the entry point for the Silk Road. So we have this, for thousands of miles overland, goods were being brought from China and the Middle East and finally arriving into Venice so that they could kind of spread out and go their ways through Europe. And so, we know Venice was home for silks, for spices, but most importantly for our story, it was a source for gemstones. And so lots of gemstones from the Middle East, from China, from all over Asia were making their way into Venice. And Venice became known as a place of not only gem trading, but also gem cutting. If we think about just the history of Italy, ancient Rome, Venice still had some leftover technique and some knowledge of the ancient times, intaglios, cameos, some of this early carving work. And so they were still kind of doing this as they're getting all of this type of material and then spreading it through the rest of Europe. So Venice is really kind of the starting point of our story, but it quickly moves out. And so as we have a kind of a new industry starting to be built in Europe, we start to define it a little bit. And the way that we define things is by giving them names. So in the 700s, we see the first lapidary corporations being developed in Paris. So lapidary, or in French, lapidaire, coming from the Latin word for stone cutter, this is really the first time that we were using this word to define this art or this practice of cutting stones into something that we could, use for jewelry or use for art or all the different ways. So Paris was one of the first places where we start to see this rise of cutting. And so at this time, it was very, what we would say now is old school. It was old school technology. And we have a couple really great sources to try and understand how they were cutting stones in this medieval period. So there's three really great ones that almost give us recipes for how to cut and polish a stone in the techniques of the time. And so they're all three different. They're all three from different countries, but they're actually quite similar. In all three ways, they're going to be basically taking the gemstone that they want to cut and polish and shape and manually grinding it, kind of like you see this guy doing. He's just rubbing this piece of cinnabar against an abrasive surface. So they would have been able to do it with grindstone in this situation, sandstone in Germany, and then, once they've got the shape down with this rough stone, they can take it to a solid piece of metal with emery. And a lot of times they say emery mixed with spit. That was the magic formula. So they would just basically manually rub stones against a flat plate and get them shiny. And so if we look at the stones from this period, pretty much everything that we see is going to be cabochons. I mean, all of history before the 1400s is all cabochons. When we get into the 1300s is really the first time that we see anything that's not cabochons or carved. And so some of the stuff that we see that might appear to be faceted is not. Like in this case, we start to get this popularity in the 1300s with the point cut. Now the point cut starts out, it's not a cut at all. It's just a diamond. It's when a perfect octahedral diamond comes out of the ground, it looks like this double-sided pyramid. They don't need to do anything to that. They would put it right into the jewelry, and this was really the first geometric idea. And they could have done this with spinel as well, any stone that grows in an attractive geometric shape, but diamond is the one that we really still see, or the one that we can still see in museums because there's a lot of examples. Now, the first thing that they would have been able to do in terms of modification for stones, for shaping into flat ways, would have been the table cut. Like here we can see a very early example. In the diamond, I think it would have been quite easy. The diamond has a perfect cleavage plane. They could have just kind of chopped the top off. Maybe didn't even need to polish it so much, but definitely in the 1300s and into the 1400s, we see these two cuts as being kind of the staple cuts really for the next couple hundred years. The first few hundred years of faceting is very slow. It doesn't change too much. Really, the technology hasn't come in yet to allow them to do very much, but we can see in the natural octahedral shape, for the diamond at least, if they were lucky enough to get a perfect one coming from India, they would have been able to just set it that way. But cabochons are still very much the fashion at this time. So we really have to think about it's not always just about the technology. Sometimes the technology is there, but the fashion hasn't caught up with the technology yet, so there's no demand yet for very many flat faceted stones. So speaking of technology, when we want to look into this late period of medieval history and see where was the next kind of iteration of the technology, we can look to Germany. Now, Germany was another one of these very early cutting centers, like France, like Venice. Idar Oberstein. So we've got two cities separated by a river, and we've had mill power by this point already for a while, grinding grain and other things. But somebody got the idea of, okay, we know that we can use water wheel power mills to turn things, so why don't we try and do it with gemstones? So they set up their water wheel down the middle of the river, and they started to grind stones like this. So they've got these huge sandstone wheels. They would lay on these benches and really just press the stone in with their whole body weight. There's no abrasive grit here. Wow, okay. There's no abrasive grit here. It's just the sandstone, the hardness of the sandstone, pressed against the hardness of the agates and the jaspers and the quartzes that they were polishing. And they could shape and make cabochons and make bowls and make all kinds of stuff this way. And so this was really the state-of-the-art technology at this time. This spread out through not just Germany, but we find them in France as well, and some in Russia. And so this was very, very popular, but very, very slow and very hard work. You can imagine how much weight you'd have to put on the stone, which is why they had to lay down on these benches to do it, because it really needed all of your body weight. And the downside of this is you can't really cut any hard stones. Sandstone is basically the same grit as quartz, so anything harder than a quartz couldn't have been polished with these types of techniques. So they were somewhat limited, but they had an abundance of agates and jaspers, so they had plenty of stuff to do for a few hundred years. Moving back into Italy, 1400s is kind of a big deal. The Italian Renaissance starts. This is really the first time we've got a rising artisan class, because we've got the rulers of the city-states deciding that they want to fund artists. They want to give money into the arts. And so we have, what we can see is artists suddenly having the money to spend their whole day working on their art and becoming super, super good. And when we think back to the Italian Renaissance, what we imagine is, some of the highest pinnacle works of art of human history. And it's all because there's suddenly funding to be able to do this. And so this is also happening in gemstones. We'll start to see an evolution of style and technology. And really the first place that we have to look is here. So this is the earliest image of a faceting machine that I've ever found. It's probably the earliest one that exists. And when we look at it, it's quite crude. It's a very crude drawing. It's coming from Germany, and it's not quite obvious how it works. But if we look into the description of the machine, they tell us a bit. They say this is a polishing mill like the Grand Masters of Venice have, on which one polishes all sorts of stones. It requires 3 polishing discs. The first is lead, the second is tin, the third is copper. So we can kind of see this is directly coming from the plate technology that was used before. They're using the same kind of plates, lead, copper, and tin, but suddenly now they are able to do things a little bit quicker. Now, if we want to try and decode this machine, it's not very clear as to how it works, but we're very, very fortunate that from the same decade, we have a much better image of the same machine. So this is coming from a manuscript in what then was called Burgundy, what now is called part of France, from Dijon. And so this is the same machine. And we can see, well, the drawing is much better. We can kind of understand how it works. But in this one, in Latin, the author tells us here, this instrument serves to polish precious stones, the fragments of which are well suited for medical use. So this machine is interesting because we have to kind of understand what gemstones are being used for at this time. Not only were they being used for jewelry, but we have to understand the medieval mindset. And this is pre-science, so there's a lot of superstition around gemstones at this time, and there's a lot of medical thought that gemstones were medicinal, and they would have been using this machine to grind them up to sort of make these medicinal potions that they were giving to, different people. And in this case, it would have been to the king, because the guy that wrote this book and left us this picture was the physician of Philip the Good in Burgundy. So he kind of lets us know that he was using this machine to grind up these potions and powders, but we can definitely see, because he also drew this really excellent drawing of this handpiece, that they were definitely using it to do faceted geometrical patterns. In the handpiece, we can see, if we look closely, there's actually numbers on each one of these. They were very aware that they could create specific angles. At least Henry Arnott was aware. We don't really know how popular this machine was. There's really just these 2 sources of information and nothing else. I don't think it was very widely used, but it's definitely where the technological story begins, and we can kind of get an idea about how it works. So, let's say the apprentice or the assistant would have been cranking this wheel while the master cutter would have been up here. We've got a flat spinning wheel, and this is the first time we've ever seen this in history, of using a flat wheel to polish facets on a stone. And in this particular orientation, they've just got the stones mounted onto these dop sticks that are basically just weighted down, and they're just kind of like letting them do their work. If we want to try and understand what kind of stones you could have done with that type of machine, we can see they're very simple. Flat tables, table cuts. They're basically using this new technology to be able to make a more interesting stone, but they're not doing very much in terms of optics or reflective patterns. They have no knowledge of this yet. Really, they're just following the shape of the rough and making it a little bit more interesting by giving it a shape and giving it a few facets on top. But the idea of faceting the bottom of the stone in order to create brilliance or even to reflect color, was totally not understood yet. All of the pieces that I've seen in museums in the microscope, the backs of the stones are not cut at all. They're tumbled almost. And this piece is exactly this kind of an example. It looks like the stone's shining. It looks like there's facets on the bottom, but there's not. There's a piece of foil underneath that's actually reflecting light. And so they would even dye the foil sometimes. If, let's say, they had a white stone and they wanted it to look red, they could dye the foils red and make it look like a bit of a more valuable stone. So lots of the stones of this period, whether they be diamonds or colored stones, have reflective foils in the back that are making them look shiny and sparkly, but because they don't know yet that they can, that there's a physical phenomenon happening in the stone that can make them shine. But they're going to figure this out soon. So if we jump into the 1500s, we're going to see the next development of the technology. So this is really the earliest single-use machine. This is one that can be operated by one person. This is in the 1530s. we've got the hand crank here. So one guy can crank this with his one hand, and then with the right hand he can do his stone work. Now this picture's a bit funny because they've twisted the lap to let you see what the whole apparatus looks like, but this isn't what it would have looked like in real life. It would have looked more like this. So we can see how he's doing it. Well, in this particular picture, he doesn't have a hand crank, and I'm kind of suspicious that maybe that's artistic license, but one way or the other, he's turning this wheel, and his gemstone is just mounted on a stick with wax, and he's faceting freehand. There's no technological device helping him make the facets, and if you've ever tried to do anything like this, it's very, very hard. So the kind of cuts that we'll be able to see for this period are still going to be very, very simple because they don't have a good way to do repeatable facets and make them all the same size and make them all the same shape and make them pretty. So they keep them simple, they keep them big, and they do a good job, but they don't get very, very sophisticated. So this is Germany, this is Nuremberg. So Nuremberg, Germany is another one of these early cutting centers that we see a lot of references to. And if we look into the early history of cutting in Bohemia, we learn a little bit more about Nuremberg. So there's a record saying that there's a guy, a gem trader called Tadeusz Mendek. He's from Prague. He goes to Nuremberg to get his Czech garnets cut, his Bohemian garnets. And when he comes back, he brings one of these machines with him. This is 1599, and they record in this town document. It has a horizontal cutting wheel, and they say it was a novelty for the region of the time. So we can kind of assume that 1599, this machine went from Germany into Prague, and we're going to come to that in a little bit. But just to kind of have an idea that this is starting to become a machine that's moving around Europe, and it's going to become the standard machine for a long time. So going back into France, we've got another region that's popping up. So we know already that Paris has been cutting for a long, long time, diamonds and colored stones. But in the 1530s, if we consider what's going on in Europe at this time, not only do we have the artistic, revolution of the Renaissance, but we also have the Protestant Reformation happening. And this is making it a little bit tricky for some of the gem traders whose job it is to, go between these different countries and doing these trades and all that stuff. So we've got a Catholic king in France, we've got Protestant gem cutters, they're getting persecuted and they're forced to leave. So some of them go to London, but a lot of them go into Switzerland, into Geneva, and so a lot of watchmakers and the lapidaries and the jewelers that work with them go into Geneva, and this is how the Swiss watch industry was born. Even though now we think of Geneva as like kind of the home of watchmaking, it's not from Geneva, it's from Germany, it's from France, and they kind of make a refuge in Geneva, and for 100 years they're doing awesome until the Calvinists rise up. And the Calvinists are kind of a really conservative sect of Protestants who are super angry that these merchants are getting so wealthy. They're doing really, really good in Geneva, and so the Calvinists kind of influence the local government to push them back out. And so over this 100 years, there's a lot of going back and forth, pushing between Catholic France and Calvinist Geneva. And so what ends up happening, okay, this is eastern France here, and we've got the Swiss border right here with Geneva, and there's a mountain range right here called Jura. And so what ends up happening is all these gem cutters kind of take refuge up in the mountains. And so Jura is like a super sleepy mountain town region. It's all farmers. And so what ends up happening, either the farmers become gem cutters or the gem cutters become farmers, or one way or the other. We've got this seasonal cycle of farming in the summer, gem cutting in the winter, and they start working in their homes and doing, this is a later image of course, but in the 1500s already they start using these hand crank tables and they're cutting stones for the watch and jewelry industry in Geneva and then taking them down across the border and selling them. And so this becomes like the safe haven for Protestant gem cutters in France. And Jura ends up becoming one of the most important cutting centers in Europe for 300 or 400 years. And so we can see this machine style is spreading around, and the quality of the cutting is getting much better. And we can see just by the pieces that are left behind, the symmetry is getting better. I mean, this one is quite perfect. We're starting to see a little bit of fancy cuts. We have this sort of star cut here. And still a lot of table cuts, a lot of just flat, simple cuts, because again, they're just using the stick with no special apparatus. But as they're starting to experiment with this stuff, they start realizing that if they put facets on the bottom, not only is it making it look a little bit more finished and polished, but they're starting to realize that something's happening. It's not just looking through a colored piece of material. It actually starts reflecting light and increasing the saturation. And we can see some really early step cuts here. This one's quite interesting. To me, I consider this kind of a transitional cut. You've got 8 facets on the top. You can see there's 4 facets on the bottom surrounding this culet. So they're starting to see a little bit in here as well that there's some color coming back if they use the right proportions. But again, everything's done by hand. We can see the facet pattern here is quite crude. You know, the lines aren't parallel, the table's a bit crooked. Exactly what you would imagine if you tried to actually just take a stick and hold it really steadily with your hand. It's really, really hard to do. So that's kind of where things were at. They're starting to understand that they can make the stone shine. So now, going back to Prague, we said that this machine went from Nuremberg to Prague in 1599. So right around the same time, Rudolf II, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, he's the King of Hungary, the King of Croatia, the King of Bohemia. He's quite a quirky guy. He moves his court to Prague. And for those of you guys, if you're as interested and obsessed with Renaissance art history as I am, Rudolf II is remembered as that weird guy made of fruit. So this is one of the depictions of Rudolf II. He was not very interested in being the Holy Roman Emperor. He was very interested in minerals. He was very interested in the Renaissance philosophy that was spreading through Europe at the time. He was interested in the occult, and he was really interested in, you know, what we would kind of call now like this new age thinking. And so he made Prague a kind of safe haven for some of these fringe artists and fringe proto-scientists, which were also kind of magicians at that time, alchemists and occultists. And so there's a lot of interesting people that come together in Prague at this time. And one of them is these guys down here. So when Rudolf moves to Prague, he issues a decree that we will now start on a large scale mining, cutting, and exporting the Bohemian garnets, which are the local stones of this era, or of this region. And so he sets up a cutting mill called the Imperial Cutting Mill, and he goes into business. And, you know, he really starts the whole industry in Bohemia for the garnets. And he invites one of the most well-known, famous gem cutting families from Italy to come and head the factory, the Miseroni. So they're from Milan. They're already really famous from the father and the grandfather. And so the Miseronis relocate to Prague, and we can see this is Dionisio Miseroni. He's surrounded by his family, his wife, his kids, his oldest son, who eventually succeeds him and takes over the factory. The son is pulling this ornately carved quartz vase off the shelf. This now is in the museum in Vienna. This still exists. This is only one part of it. The whole thing is about 7 feet tall. And it's in sections of quartz, and it's incredible. Like, all the material that they're making this period is just outrageously ornate and incredible. And it's awesome that we can kind of see them in action here, but to me, the most interesting part of this picture is actually what's happening in the background. So if we look closer, they're actually sitting in the front of the mill, in the Imperial Mill. And in the background, we see the workshop in progress. So we got the manager overseeing everything. We've got the apprentice who's cranking the big wheel. We got some ropes off the wheel that are working some carving stuff, and they're making bowls and sort of carved stuff over here. We've got a flat lap over here where he's, you know, probably cutting and polishing garnets. We can't really see what he's using. Is it a stick or is it something else? But luckily, we have another really, really good source of information from Prague at this time. So one of the other people that Rudolf II invites into his court is his court physician, Anselmus de Boot. Now, Anselmus de Boot now is remembered as like the grandfather of gemology, of mineralogy even. He was really one of the first people to really study minerals. He went all around Europe, he went to all the mining regions, and he wrote this incredible book. Everything before this period was kind of like superstitious information. You know, okay, sapphires, they're really, really good for, you know, warding off snakes. And toadstones, really, really good for poison. Bezoars, you can dip them in the wine and it neutralizes poison. This was the kind of gemology information they had in the 1500s. De Boot goes around and he starts actually studying the mines, and he's starting to get an idea, okay, they're being formed in the earth. It's not God just putting magical items in the earth for us to find. There's some process happening here, tectonics and pressure and heat, and he's starting to think about crystal systems. And so his book is really revolutionary. I mean, even now, we can almost trace every gemology book back to him and a couple of other people at this time. But for me, my favorite part of the book is the chapter that he leaves on gem cutting, because it's really probably one of the first comprehensive chapters that we see, and it's full of pictures. This is only one, but it's full of pictures. And so we can see here what's happened. From the earlier picture I showed you, 1599, we have the hand crank machine. By 1609, something has happened. They've still got the same hand crank machine, but they've added this handpiece. And now if we look to De Boot's Latin, he tells us exactly how it works. He says, for carving a gem's facets, they use a wooden wheel from which a wooden handle sticks up vertically. That's here. Through a rope, the wooden wheel moves a tin wheel on which water mixed with emery powder is sprinkled. So the tin wheel is happening over here. Next to it, he says, not far from the tin wheel, the stick of wood is erected which carries a quadrant, an instrument most ideal for the faceting of gems or leveling and carving of stones. And so here we can see the quadrant. So this is a handheld thing that you can hold. You put the stone into it, and suddenly you're not just hand holding the stone anymore. It's not going to be totally reliant on the steadiness and the textile feeling of your hand. You can put this into this handpiece, and you can recreate your facets over and over again, and you can rotate the stone without having to, be so dexterous. So this is the beginning of handpiece technology, and this is going to spread all over Europe, and it's going to change everything. Because now we don't just have to hold the stick in place. We don't have to just cut big facets because it's too hard to cut small facets. The first thing that we see is rose cutting being, rose cutting which was made for diamonds being used in the Czech garnets. And so here we can see a classic example, 15th century Czech garnets cut into the rose cut pattern. Even till today, the rose cut is the #1 cut for Czech garnets. If you go to Prague, every single garnet is rose cut. That is what they figured out works for those dark stones. If we look at some of the other stones of the period, we see they're not getting super creative yet, but the quality of the cutting is getting much better. The polishing is better. We can see that their symmetry is becoming really, really even. This is due to this new technology. Without the handpiece, without the quadrant, they wouldn't have been able to make such precise stones. And there's some other stones that have come out of this Cheapside hoard in London that aren't set, and we can see the top and the bottom of the stone, and they're absolutely perfect. When you look at the stone top down, the facet symmetry is unimprovable. It's incredible that they're able to do it with this kind of technology. So next thing that we see for the cutting, the big first inclinations of the brilliant cut. So it starts in France, middle of the 1700s. There's lots of diamonds coming into France at this point, thanks to Tavernier and other merchants who are going to India and coming back. So we start to see a lot of play. Really, throughout this whole story, France is continuously at the forefront of new ideas and new technology. And so they're really the ones that start playing around with some new patterns. And we can kind of see the progression here from, cutting the top off of the point cut, starting to modify the table cut a little bit with 8 sides. And then if you imagine that, these 2 cuts have already been in style for a couple of hundred years, just like today, you inherit grandmother's ring. It's all worn out. You take it to the gem cutter because it needs a facelift. If you're going to recut this stone into the same pattern, you're going to lose a lot of weight to shrink it down to get rid of all the abrasion on the faceting edges. What they would start to figure out is if they flatten this edge, and especially here where they've got 2 lines, if they flatten these 2 lines, suddenly, if they do it at the right angle, it's going to make 2 triangles. And so we can kind of imagine that some of these early, progressions of cutting actually come from old repair work. And we see this over and over again through the progression of the brilliant cut. Every time they change the style, and I'm not going to show all of them in here, but there's probably 8 different changes that you can see that are almost all directly linked to modifying old cuts and recutting old cuts and trying not to lose weight. And by probably the first guy that ever flattened two of these sides and seeing them turn into triangles is like having this eureka moment, like, wow, I've suddenly created a whole new style. And as this progression goes on, we're going to see it solidify into something that we know today as a really popular thing. So it starts in diamonds, but it quickly goes into colored stones. By the beginning of the 1700s, we see a lot, not a lot, but we start to see some brilliant cutting in some of the various court jewelry that still exists. And here's just a few examples. But so brilliant cutting already, at least for the crown side, is going to go between diamonds and colored stones back and forth. They're kind of learning from each other as they go. And so, of course, as soon as you start having brilliant cutting, somebody's going to get the idea to mix these together. So they're going to take the classic way that they've been cutting, which is the step cutting on the bottom. They add the brilliant cut on top, and we see a lot of stones. Even, I think we go back one here, you can see, if you look closely, this has a step cut bottom and a brilliant cut top, and it's from the early 1700s. So mixed cutting starts then, and even till today, this is the #1 cut of all colored stones. I mean, if you go into any major cutting center or just go anywhere around the Tucson show, you're going to see this cut over and over again in every single shape, because for colored stones, it's the best shape for retaining color, for increasing saturation, but also giving some brilliance. And the French picked up on this quite quickly, and then everybody else started doing it not long after that. So if we go back into Bohemia, it's 100 years after Rudolph II. He's died. His empire has switched over to something else, and along with that, where before Prague was the center of cutting in Bohemia, it's moved up to Turnov. And now Turnov is kind of right in the middle of the whole mining region of Bohemian garnets. All the Bohemian garnets pretty much come from here. There's a couple other localities down here, but this was the major region. And so if we kind of follow the cutters, we'll see them getting closer and closer to the mines, which is pretty normal, for everywhere in the world. We see a lot of cutters around mining communities. And so Turnov becomes the big cutting center for Bohemia, starting in the 1700s, and even still today, you can go to Turnov and there's a cutting school and there's cutting factories cutting Bohemian garnets. And so we see here that they've made the first modification to this quadrant handpiece. So they've taken the stick off, they've added feet, and this is giving them a little bit more flexibility to be very, very precise in the way that they polish the facets, because they can kind of micro-adjust the angles now by going left and right on the feet. Still using the same hand crank machines. And so as they have now improved the quadrant, we have been seeing actually, that it's moved pretty much all around Europe. Everyone in Europe is using quadrants at this time, almost. France has it, London has it, probably some people in Venice have it. Of course, in Bohemia, they've got it. Germany doesn't have it yet, but they're going to come here soon. So we can see coming into this next iteration of jewelry, 1700s has been called the age of the colored stone. This is really where the colored stone is getting not only so well cut, but also just so popular. The tastes are changing, and we start to see jewelry styles changing so that the stone starts becoming really the focal point of the jewelry. As before the stone was kind of the side or an accessory. Now we're starting to see jewelry being built up around stones very intentionally, showing off the beauty and the color and everything else that we love about stones. But the pressure is really on at this point. The stones have to be really, really good, because they are exactly what we're trying to look at. And because everybody has these quadrant handpieces and they have this technology that's easy to use and easy to learn, they're able to do that. So going back to the development of the brilliant cut, we start to see another variation now. So they're getting a little bit more sophisticated in their cutting. We can see here, just by the patterns that they're using, that they're definitely starting to understand certain angles are bringing light return to the stone, and they're cutting them this way on purpose. They're developing the brilliant pattern. At this time it was still called brilliance. Now we call these old mine cuts, but small table, high crown, culet facet, very distinctive. The biggest thing about this is the shape. Before the 1750s, most of the stones would have been at least for diamonds, would have been square shapes. Diamonds are square when you get them out of the ground, or they're slightly rounded with broken edges. Suddenly they're starting to use this cushion shape. Colored stones do it, diamonds are doing it. And we can kind of see the progression again of how they're getting a little bit more sophisticated in their pattern, and they're really starting to pay attention to the facets on the bottom of the stone, putting them into a very specific way, but also trying to make them, beautiful, symmetrical, easy to look at, and shiny. So, 1780s, just like the Calvinists 100 years earlier, the lower class rises up and executes the ruling class. France has their revolution. Now, for whatever, the human story, I don't know if you can say this is good or bad, but for the story of gem cutting, it's actually pretty beneficial. When everything kind of settles down, they basically write some new laws in France enabling gem cutters to have their own sort of industry. Before this time in France, all gem cutters worked underneath of jewelers. They weren't allowed to trade. They were battling back and forth for hundreds of years about who was the one who was allowed to sell gemstones, who was the one that was allowed to sell gold. After the French Revolution, they decide, okay, gem cutters, you are on your own now. You're allowed to buy and sell stones. You can't sell gold, but you are independent of, everybody else. Now, we can see through the progression, so that's happening in Paris. London, not much has really happened yet. We're in the 1780s. We can see in the 1680s, they're using the hand crank machine. In the 1780s, they're using the hand crank machine. They get the quadrant at some point, probably in the middle 1700s. 1800s, they're still kind of doing the same thing. And then Paris and London kind of have this almost simultaneous revolution of technology. It starts in France. The earliest documentation of it is 1821, and there's a book that tells us about a brand new way of cutting stones. There's no illustration, but he tells us it's a kind of wooden case which is bristling with small iron points, which serves to solidly secure the end of the dop. The device is so new in 1821, it doesn't even have a name yet. 1828, we actually see our first picture. This is from London. John Maw left us a great illustration with description of how this works. In English, we call it the jam peg, or the gem peg, as they called it back then. Eventually, in France, they call it invention, so it's kind of a bastardization of the word invention. They didn't even ever give it a real name. They just sort of called it the new invention, and that's basically what it is, the new invention. And so what they can do, they start using this in Paris, they start using it in London, and in London, it never really was superseded. We still have two cutters in London today that still use this hand crank style, cutting the old-fashioned way, cranking the wheel, using the holes in the jam peg to give them an angle. Everything else is still freehand. They're still just turning the stone by hand and making some beautiful, beautiful stones. So in London, this is still where it's at. Same period of time, we start seeing the first emerald cuts. We didn't really see this shape before. We saw emeralds were always cut in squares. All the old jewelry, they were cut in squares, and now we're starting to see them cut off the corners, start to understand that they can give some brilliance and also keep the corners safe. So we're starting to see a new cut develop. Now let's jump back to Germany. So we saw the French Revolution, we saw the quadrants, all this technology has been happening over hundreds of years. Germany is still in medieval times. They never upgraded, they never got any of this new stuff. Even though they were the first to have the hand crank table, they never adopted it, and they're still using the water wheel to polish their stones, and they're not doing very well. They can't compete with the rest of Europe. They can't do rubies and sapphires. They can't do emeralds. They're just doing agates and stuff, quartz. So there's a Bohemian cutter who's living there. They ask him, please come into Idar, retrain all of our cutters using your Bohemian stuff, and we see the whole industry of Idar Oberstein have a transformation, and they have new life because they suddenly can cut all this stuff much faster, and now they're kind of at the forefront of technology. So they get the quadrant handpiece, which everybody else has been using, but they don't really like it. So pretty much within 20 or 30 years, they already adopt the jam peg. So they kind of fast forward through the couple of hundred years that everybody else went through, and now they're caught up with everybody else. By the 1850s or 1870s, they're using the same kind of hand crank jam peg. And in Germany, this is still the way it's done. Just like those two guys in London, you know, they've got the stone on the end of a dop. There's nothing helping them rotate the stone to place the facets except for their own eye and their own feeling. And then the angles are given through the holes in the board. Now, Germany's probably thinking they are the bomb now. They are up with everybody else, but no, they're not, because as soon as that happens, France goes to the next level. And as I said, France has been the pioneer of all this technology and cutting the whole time. And so what they do, still using the hand crank machine, but they modify the jam peg head, and this has some incredible transformative results for their industry. So what they do, they add this metal plate, they put their wooden dopstick in this case, which allows them to have some references for index cutting. So now when they rotate the stone, they don't have to do it freehand. They can just put this plate against this plate, and they know, okay, this is the top, this is the bottom, this is the left, this is the right. Suddenly a stone that maybe took 6 or 7 hours to do, they can do in 1 or 2 hours. This changes everything for France because they're starting to get a lot of work. They're able to cut really, really fast, really, really good, really, really consistently. And we start to see factories, the first gem cutting factories in the world being built up in France, whereas before they were just sort of small home studios. And in Jura, it was always small studios. I mean, they did have some factories, but even until the 1980s, which is where this video comes from, the last generation, they were still cutting at home. Husband and wife, cutter and polisher, sitting in the kitchen, working with sunlight. So suddenly, France is, as always, the focal point of the whole gem trade, and they are cutting the world's stones, and they're going faster than everybody else because they've got this new technology. They end up exporting it to South America, and we see it today cutting emeralds. They exported it to Thailand, and we see it today cutting sapphires and rubies. They exported it to Israel. Israel modified it and exported it to India, and we see it in India today cutting most everything. So we can pretty much say that this Jurassian technology, which is the pinnacle of French gem cutting technology, really transformed the entire world, because I would hypothesize that most of the stones in the Tucson today were cut on machines just like this, because this is what most of the world's gem cutting industry is using. Not hand crank anymore, but the same jam peg head. And when we see the kind of stones that they're cutting on these, we can't really tell the difference between modern stones and stones from the 1800s. Brilliant cutting, step cut bottoms. They're becoming aware of the optical properties of gemstones. They're doing really, really good cutting, and they're probably doing it really, really fast because they need to be competitive and, get the work done. So going back to the stone story, we see the progression again. They're getting more sophisticated. They're understanding the pattern better. They're really understanding the proportions. That's what they're trying to understand here, is how to get the most light, how to use the stone in the best way. And so, we call these now old European cuts. Again, at that time, they were just the new brilliant style. This is where it's at, and this is really, really cool for a while. And suddenly, in our story, we need to talk about the United States for the first time. So we've had some cutters in the US for at least since the 1700s, some immigrants from Europe who knew the old-fashioned ways and had been apprenticed and did it that way. And that's what was going on in a few cities. But starting in the 1890s and really coming a little bit later, we see the first wave of amateur cutting in America. And these are some of the patent drawings and mechanical drawings of the first ideas of the machines that they're developing. So they have a totally new idea of how they want to cut the stone. They're not using jam pegs, they're not using hand pieces. They want to build this new style of what they're calling the mast machine, which is going to hold the stone and help them cut, because the people making these have not had the benefit of old world European apprenticeships. They're discovering all this stuff on their own. But before we can talk about that, we have to talk about the final crystallizing moment of the round brilliant. So this is really, thank Henry Morse for this. So this is kind of like America's big contribution to the brilliant, the one time that they get ahead of France. Henry Morse, he's got his factory in Boston. Through trial and error, he's kind of trying to figure out, he's obsessed with this idea of, what can science give us as far as gem cutting? We've got crystallography at this point. We've got the study of optics, we've got gemology, and how can we use all this stuff to figure out the best way to cut stones? So he ends up coming up with this. Marcel Tolkowski releases his treatise in 1919 about the ideal diamond, and this really changes, starting with the diamond industry, but going into colored stones as well. We see lots of round brilliants now. It was really fought against, but eventually the consumer won because the consumers fell in love with this. The thing I really like about this moment in time is we have to think 1919 is when electricity really spread around the world. You know, it came in the late 1800s, but it wasn't until really the early 1900s, and even some places until World War II in the rural places that people got electricity. So we can kind of imagine if you're a person who's buying diamond jewelry and going to parties at night, in the 1800s, that would have been candlelit parties or gas lamp lit parties. Suddenly we've got stationary electric lights. Flickering flames are going to perform a lot better in, you know, cuts that are less than ideal. Suddenly we've got stationary lights. There's no flickering, there's no dancing. The stone has to make up for it. And I wouldn't say it was on purpose that they did this. It's kind of a fun coincidence, but the modern Grand Brilliant, you can almost think of it as the stone made for electric lights. And so that's kind of where we are today with the Brilliant in diamonds and then also in colored stones used a lot. Now, going back to the States, we see something new happening. We've got all these cutters spread around the world, or spread around the US. They don't really know each other yet. There's not any movement happening yet until about 1930s. They're starting to write letters into different mineralogy magazines and starting to write letters to each other. And everybody's kind of making up their own gear. You know, there's no right way to cut a stone at this point. It's very much the pioneers of American cutting inventing something that doesn't exist yet because they don't know anything about the whole story I just told you. They're not privy to the secret information of the apprentices of old Europe because nobody talks about that. Nobody ever talked about it. There was no books until 1935 when one guy in America went all around America and said, how do you do this? How do you do this? How do you do this? And he wrote a book and said in the preface of the book, we don't know what we're doing, but we just ask everybody what they tried, and this is a book of what we found that works. This is how the American gem cutting industry started, and everything that we see here today, all these competition cutters and precision cutters start here with homemade gear and just a pioneering spirit. And so 1940s starts kind of the big wave of American cutting, and we start to see some, you know, regular manufacturers that still exist today. Graves being the first, and then eventually, you know, we got Raytech with the handpiece, Ultratech's in the 65, and then Facetron in 79. These guys all still exist today. So Graves coming from really that early phase, or maybe the second wave phase, but still existing into the modern day. Now, one more thing I have to tell you guys about before we're at the present moment, which is we have to go back to Germany. So Bernd Munsteiner, this is a guy he's gone through the traditional apprenticeship system. He's done his 6 years as an apprentice. He knows the German JAMPEG, and he is not at all interested in cutting stones for jewelry. He doesn't like it. He sees it as, I don't know, maybe a tasteless expression of commerce. This guy is a true artist. He's gone through you know, his apprenticeship, but he's not interested in following his forefathers, and he starts getting some new ideas about how he's going to use crystallography and some new cutting techniques that he pioneers, and starts doing this super interesting work that nobody has ever seen before. And, you know, it's pretty popular in Germany. It's not really spread so much around the world, I don't think. But when it comes to America, like in the 80s, it really catches people's imaginations. And we start to see some early cutters in the 80s playing with these kinds of concave shapes where instead of making flat facets on the back, it's kind of like carving a little bit into the back of the stone to create these funky patterns. Now, Bernd is working on a large scale. This one, I think, some of these might actually be here in the GJX show. I saw them here before. They're huge. I mean, some of these are 2 or 3 feet tall. They're not jewelry. But when it comes to America, they start to do this sort of idea, you know, in an American way with the jewelry, and we start to see a new expression of the lapidary community rise up with some new machines. So starting in the 90s, we have a new machine coming out just made to do curved shapes in the back of the stone. So you can do some really crazy special effects with the stones, with concave cutting. And, you know, from the 90s, this has gone until now. You can go around the show here today, and, you know, we've got guys like Dalen Hargrave and all these guys that are doing super, super creative, crazy stuff between carving, concave, and flat faceting. So that kind of brings us to where we're at now, you know, 2000s. Where can we go? I kind of see it as 2 different tracks. We've got, you know, where we're at in America. UK, Australia, Russia, these kind of competition cutting cultures that have risen up. And what we're seeing is, a demand for the newest, craziest, innovative styles, concave cutting, precision cutting, computer-aided light response cutting. And then in Europe, we've got really a reverence for the old traditional styles. When you go into Europe and see the cutting that's being done there, it's very much in the tradition of everything I just told you. Mixed cuts, step cuts, brilliant cuts, and they're not so into what's happening in America. So where does this leave us now? We've seen 500 years of history. We've seen the rise and fall of all these different industries. And where can we go? For me, for my opinion, as the person who's obsessed with this story, we've got this idea that the cutting culture is dying. In Europe, it definitely is. In Asia, it's very weak. In America, it's up and down. And so our idea, out in Bangkok, we started this school to make new cutters. And so my job, my self-appointed job, is to go around and inspire everyone with this story to understand the context for gem cutting as a Renaissance art, as a Victorian art, as a modern art. It's something that we haven't spoke about. The gem cutters have always been very secluded, very secretive, and it hasn't really gotten the light that the jewelry has, that the architecture has, that the Renaissance carvings have. But when you go into the museums, there's gemstones in there with everything else, but we don't really think about that. The young art school student is not going into art school thinking about gem cutting. They're thinking about painting or goldsmithing. But if we can make new cutters, we can inspire them with this romantic story. This is what we're doing. And so this is my job, is to go around and talk to everybody and let them know that you can be part of this story, or at least the younger generation needs to be part of this story, because we need new blood. We need new cutters. We need new ideas, because the gem trade must go on. I mean, of course it will go on. We don't just need to see mass production cutting from the Asian cutting centers of the world. We need all this creativity that we're seeing in all over the world. And that's basically our mission. So Institute of Gem Trading, that's kind of my idea of behind the classes that we're doing, and my job is going around talking about this story. So that's my story. I want to thank you guys for being here. If you want to know more, you can take a picture of this. This is some of the better books that I found talking about this story and talking about some of the really good points throughout history. So thanks. You guys have any questions before we run out of time? I know that was a lot of information for 50 minutes. That was 500 years. So yeah, I recommend going out now and checking out the stones out in the show and see if you see some of the stuff that I'm talking about here. Concave stuff, I doubt you're going to see Renaissance stones here, but some of the different styles. Yeah.
Was there any cutting done in Asia? What were they doing there?
In Asia, that's a big question. I can speak about Thailand. In 1850, there was a guy that went to Thailand, a French guy, and said, wow, there's a lot of gemstones coming out of Thailand. They have no cutters. I'm pretty sure that Thailand industry started in 1900 when France invaded Cambodia, and somebody brought a gem cutting machine, because the place that France invaded in Cambodia is the mining region that sits between Thailand and Cambodia. And that's where they started using these French machines in Thailand. So I'm pretty sure first 10 years of the 1900s is when Asia starts. India, I didn't talk about it at all, because India is the mother of all this. They were already doing cutting in India 2,000 years ago, but not faceting. I think the faceting, they might have pioneered it, but then they had to catch up to European because of the technology. They just didn't have it. But yeah, Sri Lanka was doing it for a long, long time, like thousands of years. Marco Polo was in Sri Lanka talking about the stones. People from like 50 BC were in Sri Lanka writing about the stones, and not necessarily the cutting, but they were definitely cutting them. But yeah, so Asia has an old history, but I have to talk about that in a different story. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you guys. I appreciate you being here. And If you want to know more about the school, we got a booth in the 22nd Street show, or you just want to come say hi, I'm going to be there afternoons all week. So thanks for coming.